Every avoidant builds a quiet, unspoken filing system for the people in their life, sorting them, almost automatically, into categories based on how much they can get away with. Some people get filed as unpredictable, requiring caution and careful management. Others get filed as safe, meaning safe specifically for the avoidant's own inconsistency. People whose patience seems inexhaustible, whose boundaries seem more theoretical than real, whose love seems durable enough to survive almost anything thrown at it without ever actually running out. This second category is the one that matters here, because it's the one currently being quietly, painfully revised, and the avoidant doing that revising rarely announces it out loud. What follows is an explanation of exactly how this specific category gets built in the first place, why it so often turns out to be wrong, and what actually happens inside an avoidant once the evidence contradicting it becomes too significant to keep ignoring. This isn't simply another version of realizing someone is gone. It's something more specific and, in its own way, more humbling. The recognition that an entire internal model of who someone is, built and relied upon for months or years, was fundamentally, embarrassingly, inaccurate. Anyone listening who has spent a relationship being quietly filed away as endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, someone who could be taken for granted without real consequence, only to eventually demonstrate, through boundaries and consequences that actually held, that this filing was never accurate in the first place, deserves to understand exactly what that demonstration is currently doing inside the avoidant who built that inaccurate model to begin with. It's worth naming, before going further, why this particular topic deserves such careful, dedicated examination, rather than being treated as simply another variation of an avoidant eventually missing someone they've lost. This specific pattern touches something distinct from ordinary grief or ordinary regret, a genuine crisis of self-assessment that operates according to its own particular psychological logic, one that reveals something important, not just about this specific relationship, but about how avoidants generally tend to misjudge and mismanage the actual limits of the people closest to them, often for considerably longer than would be possible if those limits were being assessed accurately from the very beginning. To understand why avoidants build this specific category in the first place, it helps to examine what function it actually serves within their broader relational strategy. Avoidants, as explored extensively elsewhere, tend to organize their relationships around maintaining a predictable, manageable level of closeness, one that allows genuine connection without requiring the kind of full, exposed vulnerability their defenses are built to avoid. This management requires some degree of confidence regarding how a partner will respond to inconsistency, distance, and the various small and large ways an avoidant's usual patterns tend to test a relationship's stability over time. When a partner responds to this testing with continued patience, continued effort, and an apparent absence of any consequence severe enough to threaten the relationship's continuation, an avoidance internal model quickly and efficiently updates to reflect this pattern, categorizing that partner as safe, meaning specifically safe from the kind of accountability that would require the avoidant to actually change their behavior. This categorization isn't necessarily conscious or deliberate. It develops gradually, through repeated confirmation, the same way any efficient mental shortcut develops, through pattern recognition that reduces the cognitive and emotional effort required to navigate an ongoing relationship. This category, once established, tends to become remarkably resistant to revision, precisely because it serves such a useful function for the avoidant maintaining it. It's worth naming why avoidants, specifically, tend to test boundaries so repeatedly throughout a relationship, rather than simply accepting an initial assessment and leaving it unexamined from that point forward. This repeated testing isn't typically a deliberate, conscious strategy. It reflects something closer to an ongoing, largely unconscious need for reassurance regarding the relationship's actual stability. A need that operates specifically because avoidants, as discussed throughout other examinations of this topic, tend to carry deep uncertainty regarding whether closeness can ever really be trusted to remain stable and secure. Each instance of testing a boundary and finding it hasn't actually held firm provides a kind of reassurance, however illusory, that the relationship remains safely within the avoidant's control. that no single behaviour has yet crossed a line severe enough to produce a genuine, lasting consequence. This explains why the category of endless tolerance, once established, tends to require increasingly significant tests over time in order to sustain itself, since smaller, more minor tests eventually stop providing fresh reassurance once they've already been confirmed repeatedly. This pattern often produces a kind of gradual escalation across a relationship's history, an avoidant unconsciously testing progressively larger boundaries as the relationship continues, not necessarily because they consciously want to cause more significant harm, but because smaller tests have already been thoroughly confirmed and no longer provide the same reassurance they once did. This escalation is worth naming directly because it explains a pattern many people recognize only in hindsight, a relationship where the avoidance testing seemed to grow progressively more serious over time, culminating eventually in exactly the kind of significant boundary violation that finally produced the real, lasting consequence this exploration has been describing throughout. Believing that a partner's patience is essentially limitless allows an avoidant to continue their usual patterns of inconsistency and distance, without having to seriously reckon with the possibility that those patterns might eventually produce a real, significant consequence. This belief, however inaccurate it may ultimately turn out to be, offers a considerable amount of psychological comfort, precisely because it removes the anxiety that might otherwise accompany ongoing uncertainty about whether a given behaviour might finally be the one that goes too far. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture someone who has spent years relying on a particular bridge to support increasingly heavy loads, never once testing its actual limits, simply assuming, based on its performance so far, that it can handle whatever continues to be placed on it. This assumption isn't unreasonable exactly, given the bridge's history of apparent reliability, but it's also never actually been tested against its true maximum capacity, because no load heavy enough to reveal that capacity has ever actually been applied. The bridge's apparent limitlessness is, in this sense, simply untested rather than confirmed, a distinction that becomes suddenly, dramatically important the moment a load finally arrives that exceeds what the bridge can actually bear. This is close to what happens when an avoidant finally encounters the actual limits of a partner they'd previously confidently categorized as endlessly tolerant. The category wasn't necessarily built on deliberate deception or dishonesty on the partner's part. It was built on an accumulation of moments where the partner's actual limits simply hadn't yet been tested severely enough to reveal themselves. Moments the avoidant mistook for confirmation of limitless tolerance rather than what they actually were. Evidence of tolerance that, while real, was never actually unlimited to begin with. It's worth naming specifically what tends to trigger the collapse of this category, because it rarely happens through any single dramatic event, but rather through an accumulation of evidence that eventually becomes impossible to explain away, using the avoidant's previous comfortable assumptions. It helps to describe a few specific forms this triggering evidence tends to take, because concrete examples make the overall pattern considerably easier to recognize than an abstract description alone ever could. One common form involves an avoidance attempt at their usual reconnection tactics, the small gestures or renewed charm that previously reliably restored access and restored the relationship's usual rhythm, simply failing to produce any response at all. This absence of the expected response tends to be one of the earliest, clearest pieces of evidence contradicting the previous category, since it directly, undeniably contradicts the specific prediction that category was built to make. Another common form involves discovering, often through some indirect channel, that the person they'd assumed would remain perpetually available and perpetually hopeful has instead built a genuinely full, independent life that doesn't appear to be waiting for anything. New routines, new relationships, new sources of meaning that exist entirely apart from any possibility of the avoidance eventual return. This particular piece of evidence tends to be especially destabilizing, precisely because it confirms not just that a boundary was held, but that life continued moving forward robustly during the holding of it, removing any lingering assumption that the boundary might simply be a temporary, fragile position waiting to collapse under sufficient pressure or sufficient time. A further common form involves witnessing, sometimes secondhand, a direct, honest account of the relationship's difficulties being shared without the usual softening or vague, blameless framing an avoidant might have previously expected or hoped for, a clear, accurate acknowledgement of specific harm, rather than the generous, protective narrative already explored in other examinations of avoidant psychology. This kind of honest, unflinching account tends to confirm, more directly than almost any other single piece of evidence, that the person being reassessed was never actually the endlessly accommodating figure the avoidant had constructed in their own mind. This typically also involves witnessing a boundary held with genuine consistency, rather than the kind of boundary that gets stated once and then quietly abandoned once the avoidant applies enough gentle pressure or enough time. It involves witnessing consequences actually follow through on what was previously only threatened, distance that remains distance rather than eventually softening back into the previous pattern of access and availability. And it involves witnessing this consistency sustained specifically during moments when the avoidant, based on previous experience, would have expected it to eventually break, moments of renewed effort or renewed charm, that this time simply don't produce the reversal they reliably produced before. This accumulated evidence tends to produce a genuine, significant crisis within the avoidant's previous, comfortable categorization, precisely because it can no longer be dismissed as an anomaly or a temporary deviation from the expected pattern. Once this evidence becomes undeniable, an avoidant is forced to confront something considerably more disorienting than simply losing access to a specific person. They're forced to confront the fact that their own internal model, relied upon confidently for a considerable stretch of time, was fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. This distinction between losing a person and discovering a significant error in one's own judgment matters enormously for understanding why this particular realization tends to produce such a specific, recognizable quality of disorientation, distinct from ordinary grief or ordinary regret already explored in other examinations of avoidant psychology. Grief and regret center on loss. This particular disorientation centers on being wrong, specifically wrong about something the avoidant likely felt quite confident about, a confidence that made the eventual correction considerably more jarring than it would have been had that confidence never existed in the first place. There's something worth naming here regarding why this specific kind of being wrong tends to activate such a significant response within avoidant psychology, particularly considerably more significant than it might for someone with a different relational style. Avoidants, as discussed throughout other examinations of this topic, tend to place considerable value on their own perceived competence and control, partly because these qualities offer a sense of safety and predictability that feels considerably more manageable than genuine emotional vulnerability. Discovering a significant miscalculation regarding something as fundamental as another person's actual boundaries and actual limits directly threatens this sense of competence and control, suggesting that the avoidant's usual methods of assessing and managing relationships may be considerably less reliable than they'd previously assumed. This threat to perceived competence, layered on top of whatever grief or regret might also be developing regarding the specific relationship itself, tends to produce a particular kind of unsettled, destabilized quality that's worth naming clearly because it explains behavior that might otherwise seem confusing or disproportionate to simply losing a partner. An avoidant confronting this realization isn't just processing loss. They're processing a genuine crisis of self-assessment, a confrontation with the possibility that their entire strategy for reading and managing relationships, relied upon across many different connections, may be built on considerably shakier foundations than they'd previously understood it to be. It's worth naming what this specific realization tends to look like as it develops, because it often unfolds through a gradual, retrospective reprocessing of memories that previously seemed unremarkable, but that now, viewed through this new corrected lens, take on considerably different significance. Small moments of firmness or clarity that were previously dismissed or minimized get reconsidered, sometimes with a kind of belated respect that wasn't extended to them the first time they actually occurred. Instances of patience that were previously assumed to reflect limitless tolerance get re-examined as evidence of considerable, if not infinite, self-restraint, restraint that, in hindsight, clearly had an eventual limit the avoidant simply hadn't managed to locate until it was finally definitively reached. This retrospective reprocessing often produces something worth naming specifically, a considerable increase in respect, arriving considerably later than it would have been useful to the relationship itself, but genuine nonetheless. Recognizing that someone held real boundaries, exercised real restraint, and ultimately proved considerably less endlessly available than initially assumed, tends to produce a kind of admiration that operates according to its own particular psychological logic, one that doesn't necessarily correlate with how attractive or how compatible that same behavior seemed while the relationship was actually active and this kind of firmness hadn't yet been fully demonstrated. There's something worth naming about why this particular kind of respect develops so reliably in response to boundaries actually being enforced, rather than simply stated, because understanding this mechanism explains a pattern that many people find genuinely confusing, why boundaries seem to matter so little until the moment they're actually consistently upheld. Boundaries that get stated but not enforced don't actually provide the kind of information an avoidance relational assessment relies on. They remain functionally indistinguishable from empty threats, words without accompanying evidence regarding what will actually happen if they're tested. Boundaries that get genuinely, consistently enforced provide considerably more useful, considerably more convincing information, precisely because they demonstrate through actual behavior rather than mere statement exactly where a person's real limits actually exist. This explains why respect tends to develop specifically in response to consistent follow-through rather than in response to the initial statement of a boundary, however clearly and however firmly that initial statement might have been delivered. Words alone, however well chosen, simply don't carry the same weight as demonstrated, sustained action, particularly for someone whose own relational patterns have taught them, through considerable prior experience, that most people's stated limits tend to soften considerably once enough time or enough charm gets applied against them. It's worth addressing directly something that deserves careful, honest attention, because everything explored throughout this piece could easily be misread as suggesting that holding firm boundaries functions as some kind of strategic technique for eventually earning an avoidance respect and eventually motivating their return. This would represent a significant misapplication of everything being explored here. The boundaries and consistency being described throughout this exploration only produce this particular effect when they're genuine and authentic reflection of someone's actual limits and actual self-respect, rather than a calculated performance designed specifically to produce this exact reaction in someone else. This distinction matters enormously, both because avoidants, as discussed in other explorations of this topic, tend to be reasonably capable of eventually sensing the difference between genuine boundaries and performed ones deployed strategically, and because building one's entire approach to boundary setting around producing a specific effect in someone else keeps that boundary setting oriented outward, toward managing someone else's eventual reaction, rather than genuinely, authentically oriented inward toward one's own actual values and actual self-respect. Boundaries held for the sake of eventually impressing or attracting back an avoidant partner aren't actually the same thing as boundaries held because they reflect genuine, non-negotiable self-respect. and this difference tends to be sensed, even if never articulated directly by everyone involved. There's an important caution worth naming here as well, distinct from the earlier caution about performing boundaries strategically to earn respect, because this one addresses something that can develop once someone has genuinely experienced this kind of belated vindication or belated respect, whether witnessed directly or simply understood as likely based on everything explored throughout this exploration. It can become tempting, once boundaries have genuinely produced this kind of significant realization, to begin treating boundary setting itself as a tool primarily useful for producing this specific effect in others, rather than as a genuine expression of one's own values and one's own limits, applied consistently regardless of whether it ever produces any particular reaction in anyone else. This shift from boundaries as genuine self-respect toward boundaries as a strategic tool for managing other people's eventual perception represents a meaningful and worth avoiding change, even though it can happen gradually and without much conscious awareness that it's occurring. Boundaries maintained primarily to eventually produce respect or regret in someone else tend to become rigid and performative in ways that genuine, authentically held boundaries never actually are, applied inflexibly, regardless of context, maintained more for their anticipated effect on an audience than for their actual practical function in protecting one's own genuine well-being. The healthiest orientation toward boundary setting, the one that actually produced the genuine, respect-worthy consistency this entire exploration has been examining, remains oriented primarily inward, toward one's own actual needs and one's own actual limits, applied because they're true and necessary, rather than because of any anticipated effect they might eventually produce in someone else's internal reassessment. Maintaining this inward orientation, even after experiencing or imagining the kind of belated vindication this exploration has described, protects against boundaries gradually curdling into something considerably less healthy than what originally produced them. There's something crucial worth naming here as well, regarding what this specific realization does and doesn't predict about an avoidant's eventual behavior going forward. Because it would be dishonest to suggest that developing this kind of belated respect automatically translates into any particular action or any particular outcome. Respect, however genuine and however significant, remains a distinct psychological experience from the sustained behavioral change that would actually be required for any renewed relationship to succeed differently than the one that produced this respect in the first place. An avoidant can genuinely, deeply respect someone's boundaries and someone's demonstrated self-respect, while still lacking the actual capacity or actual motivation to offer the kind of consistency that respect alone doesn't automatically produce. This means the appropriate response to recognizing that this specific kind of belated respect might be developing on the other side of a relationship's ending isn't excitement, and it isn't dismissal either. It's simply accurate, unemotional acknowledgement that this recognition, however genuine, doesn't obligate anyone to wait for it to develop into anything more substantial, and doesn't require reopening a relationship simply because the person on the other side of it has finally, belatedly, recognized something that would have been considerably more useful to recognize while the relationship was still active and still salvageable. There's something worth exploring further because it addresses a specific, practical question that naturally follows from everything discussed so far. Whether this kind of significant corrective realization tends to produce lasting change in how an avoidant approaches boundaries and limits within whatever relationships come after the one that produced this particular reassessment. The honest answer, consistent with everything already explored throughout other examinations of avoidant psychology, resists a simple, satisfying prediction in either direction. Though it's worth naming a few specific patterns that tend to emerge. For some avoidants, this kind of significant, undeniable correction does produce a genuine, lasting shift in how they assess and respect boundaries going forward. A newfound wariness about assuming any partner's patience is limitless, informed directly by the specific memory of having been so significantly, embarrassingly, wrong about this exact assumption before. This shift, when it occurs, tends to benefit whoever the avoidant goes on to build a relationship with next, benefiting from a lesson that, however belatedly and however painfully learned, wasn't available to the person whose boundaries actually taught it in the first place. For other avoidants, this same correction produces something less durable, a specific, isolated recognition regarding one particular person and one particular relationship, without generalizing into any broader, lasting change in how boundaries get assessed and respected more generally. These avoidants might genuinely, significantly reassess their previous misjudgment regarding this specific former partner, while continuing to make similar, if not identical, misjudgments in whatever relationships come next, having failed to extract the more general, transferable lesson that this specific experience could have offered them. There's no reliable way to predict which of these two patterns a particular avoidant will ultimately follow, and this uncertainty deserves to be named honestly, rather than resolved into false confidence in either direction. What can be said with more confidence is that this uncertainty, whichever direction it ultimately resolves toward, belongs entirely to the avoidant's own separate journey, one that isn't the responsibility of whoever's boundaries originally produced the correction to monitor, encourage, or feel disappointed by, regardless of which direction it ultimately takes. There's something worth turning toward now that centers entirely on the person whose boundaries produce this belated realization, rather than on the avoidant currently reprocessing their previous inaccurate assumptions, because everything explored throughout this piece has necessarily focused on decoding that avoidant's internal experience of being wrong, and that focus, however clarifying, shouldn't overshadow what actually matters most for the person who held those boundaries in the first place. Holding genuine, consistent boundaries throughout a relationship with someone who repeatedly tested them, and continuing to hold those same boundaries even after the relationship ended, represents genuine, significant self-respect, regardless of whether the avoidant on the other side of that relationship ever recognizes or reprocesses it accurately. It's worth naming what developing this specific capacity for genuine, sustained boundaries actually required, because it's easy to underestimate its significance simply because it may have felt in the moment like simple stubbornness or simple refusal, rather than something more deliberately cultivated. For many people, especially those whose own history includes patterns of prioritizing others' comfort over their own genuine needs, developing the capacity to hold a boundary consistently, even against someone they loved, even against someone whose testing and pressure was genuinely difficult to withstand, represents considerable, hard-won psychological growth. This growth doesn't happen automatically or effortlessly, and it often requires its own internal work, addressing whatever earlier patterns made boundary holding difficult in the first place, before the kind of consistency this exploration has been describing throughout becomes genuinely sustainable rather than a constant, exhausting struggle against one's own instincts. Recognizing this growth clearly, independent of whether an avoidant ex-partner ever comes to appreciate or reassess it accurately, matters considerably for anyone who has been navigating this specific journey. The capacity to hold genuine boundaries, once developed, doesn't remain limited to this one specific relationship. It becomes a durable, transferable skill, protecting against similar patterns of being taken for granted in whatever relationships and whatever circumstances come next, entirely independent of whether this particular avoidant ever manages to fully, accurately understand what they actually lost. This self-respect doesn't require an avoidant's eventual, belated acknowledgement in order to be valid or significant. It was valid the moment it was demonstrated, a genuine reflection of one's own worth that never actually depended on being correctly perceived or correctly categorized by someone else in order to be real. For anyone listening who recognizes themselves as someone who was once quietly, inaccurately filed away as endlessly tolerant, only to eventually demonstrate, through genuine boundaries and genuine consequences, that this filing was never accurate, There's something important worth claiming here. That demonstration wasn't performed for the avoidant's eventual benefit or eventual recognition. It reflected something true about your own limits and your own self-respect, something that existed and mattered entirely independent of whether the person who misjudged it ever came to understand it accurately or ever came to understand it at all. There's a final point worth making, because it reframes the actual significance of everything explored throughout this entire piece in a way that matters considerably more than any specific question about whether a particular avoidant's belated respect ever produces a particular action or a particular outcome. This entire pattern, an inaccurate category, quietly, painfully being corrected through undeniable evidence, reveals something significant about the actual limits of taking anyone for granted indefinitely, regardless of how patient or how forgiving they may have initially appeared. Genuine self-respect, however quietly and however patiently it coexists alongside genuine love, tends to eventually reveal itself as real, whether or not the person who benefited from its earlier, undemonstrated form ever bothered to test its actual boundaries, while there was still time for that revelation to matter. For anyone listening who has watched an avoidant ex-partner slowly, belatedly come to recognize that they were never actually as endlessly patient or as endlessly available as initially assumed, there's a specific kind of quiet satisfaction worth allowing oneself to feel here, not as vindication requiring an avoidant's eventual confirmation, but simply as accurate confirmation of something that was always true, regardless of when or whether it ever got recognized correctly by the person who spent so long assuming otherwise. There's one final thought worth leaving on because it addresses something worth naming honestly rather than leaving implied. Being misjudged as endlessly tolerant, taken for granted based on an inaccurate assumption about the depth of one's own patience, is its own particular kind of pain. One that deserves acknowledgement separate from whatever eventual correction or eventual respect might follow it. Nobody should have to demonstrate their actual limits through prolonged mistreatment simply in order to eventually earn accurate recognition of those limits from someone who should have respected them from the very beginning without requiring proof at all. There's something worth naming, finally, about how to hold this entire realization without either dismissing it as meaningless or overvaluing it as something requiring action. Belated respect, arriving after a relationship has already ended, doesn't undo the pain of having been underestimated throughout that relationship's active history. But it isn't entirely without value either, offering a kind of quiet retrospective confirmation that one's own perception of the relationship's dynamics, one's own sense that the treatment being received didn't match what was actually being offered in return, was accurate all along, rather than an exaggeration or a misreading born of oversensitivity. This confirmation, however late and however incomplete, still serves a genuine, if modest, function in solidifying trust in one's own judgment going forward, judgment that may have been quietly, persistently doubted throughout a relationship where an avoidant partner's confident, if inaccurate, assumptions about one's own limitless tolerance went largely unchallenged and unexamined for far too long. This is worth naming because it prevents this entire exploration from being read as suggesting that being misjudged this way was somehow worthwhile, simply because it eventually produced this particular belated correction. It wasn't worthwhile in that sense, and nobody should have to endure being underestimated and taken advantage of in order to eventually receive the respect that should have been extended from the start, based simply on treating another person's stated boundaries and stated needs as genuinely credible the first time they were actually expressed. The correction being described throughout this exploration is real and it matters, but it was never the goal. The goal was always simply to be seen accurately and respected accordingly from the very beginning, a goal that, in this specific case, took considerably longer to achieve than it ever should have.